Matthew and Mark both narrate a similar incident during Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin. False witnesses claimed that he said, "I'll destroy this temple and rebuild it in 3 days." So what exactly is going on here? Is this Jesus the terrorist? Dropping an accusation like that was certainly a powder keg ready to ignite outrage against Jesus. The Jews held a profound attachment to the temple, so even suggesting its destruction was akin to throwing fuel on a blazing fire. This is an unfamiliar territory even in our own time. Cracking a joke about storming the Capitol in Washington, D.C. or blowing up the Vatican is probably a no-go, and for good reason. But if this were merely a concocted tale to smear Jesus, they could have amped up the drama. Why bring in the notion of rebuilding the temple? Why not just allege that he wanted to destroy it? And what is with this intricate detail about 3 days? It doesn't sound like a blatant fabrication. Rather, it resembles a distorted version of something Jesus might have actually said. But here's the curveball. None of the synoptic gospels, not even Matthew or Mark, records Jesus uttering anything remotely similar. No discussion of wrecking the temple, no hint of rebuilding it in 3 days, not a single word to shed light on the origin of this accusation. In order to get the lowdown, you have to flip over to John's Gospel, where you'll find the scoop in a completely different passage, talking about a whole different time in Jesus' ministry. John 2:13-21 reads, "The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to the temple. In the temple he found those that were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he said to those who sold the pigeons, 'Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade.' His disciples remembered that it was written, 'Zeal for your house will consume me.' So the Jews said to him, 'What sign do you show us for doing these things?' Jesus said, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.' Then the Jews said, 'It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?' But he was speaking about the temple of his body. So in John's account, Jesus boldly declared years ago that he could rebuild the temple in 3 days if it was torn down. This statement is casually recorded by John as his response to those challenging his authority in cleansing the temple of the money changers. John interprets this as a powerful prediction of Jesus' resurrection and a bold proclamation of his divine authority. Now, here is the intriguing part. During Jesus' trial in John's Gospel, there's not a whisper about the witnesses who claimed he threatened to destroy the temple. And as I mentioned earlier, none of the synoptic Gospels like Matthew or Mark even features the scene where Jesus declares, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up." To grasp the full narrative, you have to piece both accounts together. Jesus makes a cryptic statement about resurrecting the temple in 3 days if destroyed. He sees it as a prophecy of his resurrection, despite the potential confusion and disturbance it might cause. This statement gets etched in memory, but then takes a twisted turn when retold. During his trial, it resurfaces as an accusation of him, making what sounds like terrorist threats against the temple. This scenario not only makes logical sense, but it feels inherently believable. Yet, to paint this comprehensive picture, you must combine John's account with what is in Mark and Matthew. It's far from a deliberate scheme, and much more like truthful testimony. This is a classic example of an undesigned coincidence. But there's more here. Let's take a look again at John 2:18-20. Now, pay attention to the date mentioned by the Jews. It has taken us 46 years to rebuild this temple. Now let's piece together the timeline here. According to the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, Herod the Great started rebuilding the temple around 19 BC. Fast forward 46 years and we land in 28 AD. Now, Luke 3:1 tells us that Jesus began his public preaching in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar's reign, which brings us to 27 AD, when Jesus was baptized and kicked off his ministry. Now, here is the kicker. In the year 14 AD, Augustus Caesar died. Just 2 years before that, in the fall of 12 AD, according to Suetonius, the Roman historian, Augustus teamed up with Tiberius as co-emperor to ensure that things get transitioned smoothly. Fast forward to the next Passover in the spring of 28 AD, and that's when Jesus turned the tables at the temple. So, combining intel from John, Luke, Josephus, and Suetonius, we actually have a very solid date for when Jesus cleared house at the temple. This alignment strongly suggests that there's truth to the sources. These kinds of coincidences are best explained by the sources having a foundation in truth. The skeptics online telling you that the gospel writers are just basically writing fiction simply have not come up with an adequate explanation for these kinds of facts. By now in this series, I trust that you've noticed the multitude of undesigned coincidences. It's just too much to dismiss as accidental, considering the subtlety and casual nature of these comments by the gospel authors. Design isn't a plausible theory either. I hope you've been enjoying this series, and believe it or not, I have even more examples to go through in future videos, so be sure to stay tuned.